"Stop right there. You don't belong in this section." The words cut through the pristine silence of the Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts like a blade through velvet. They weren't whispered. They weren't suggested. They were commanded with the authority of someone who believed he held absolute power over who could walk where, when, and why. Greg Morrison, head of security at the museum in downtown Chicago, stood with his arms crossed, badge gleaming under the soft gallery lighting, blocking the entrance to the Renaissance Religious Art Wing. His voice carried across the marble floors, past the carefully curated displays and straight into the ears of every visitor within 50 feet. He looked directly at her, at the black woman in the simple brown habit, and made his decision without a single question. What he didn't know was that in exactly 1 hour, his face would be on every major news network in America. What he couldn't have predicted was that by evening, the Vatican itself would be calling. And what he never imagined was that the woman standing before him, the one he was treating like an intruder, would become the center of a story that would shake the very foundations of how religious institutions handle discrimination. Sister Alicia Reeves walked through the museum's glass entrance doors alone. No entourage, no announcement, no special treatment requested. Just a woman in her traditional Franciscan habit, brown and simple, carrying a worn leather satchel and moving with the quiet dignity that comes from 30 years of service. Her steps were measured, purposeful, but unhurried as she crossed the polished lobby floor. She had come to Chicago for the National Conference on Faith and Social Justice, but she'd carved out this Tuesday morning for something personal. The museum housed the largest collection of medieval religious manuscripts in the Midwest, including several texts that had influenced her doctoral dissertation 25 years earlier. She wanted to see them again, to touch base with the scholarship that had shaped her understanding of contemplative traditions. At the information desk, she approached Madison Clark, the young curator with perfectly styled blonde hair and a museum badge that read, "Guest Services." Madison looked up from her computer screen, her smile polite but distant. "I'd like to visit the Renaissance Religious Art Collection," Sister Alicia said quietly. Madison's eyes swept over the habit, the simple cross around Sister Alicia's neck, the absence of any designer accessories or obvious wealth markers. She didn't smile back. "That's a restricted section," Madison replied, not looking up from her screen. "You need special authorization to access those galleries." Sister Alicia blinked. "I wasn't aware of restrictions. The website said it was open to the public during regular hours." Madison finally looked up, her expression unchanged. "Well, that section requires additional verification. Are you here with a tour group?" "No, I'm here independently. I'm a nun with the Franciscan Sisters of Chicago. I have identification if you need it." But Madison had already pressed a button on her desk. Her voice came through the overhead speakers. "Security to the front desk. We have a situation that needs immediate attention." Sister Alicia stood perfectly still. She had experienced this before, this sudden shift from neutral service to suspicious scrutiny. But not in a place dedicated to sacred art. Not in a space that claimed to celebrate the very faith she had devoted her life to serving. The situation Madison had called in wasn't Sister Alicia's presence. It was her assumption that a black woman in religious garb couldn't possibly have legitimate business in their premium collection. From across the lobby, Greg Morrison appeared, walking with the confident stride of someone who had never been questioned about his authority. At 52, he had worked museum security for 8 years, but he had never worked anywhere that required him to think critically about bias. Behind him walked his colleague, Denzel Washington, a younger black security guard who had been on the job for 6 months and had already noticed patterns he didn't like. Greg approached the desk without acknowledging Sister Alicia directly. "What's the issue?" he asked Madison. Madison nodded toward Sister Alicia. "She wants access to the restricted collection without proper credentials." Sister Alicia stepped forward calmly. "I have identification. I'm a member of the clergy, and I'd be happy to provide any verification you need." Greg finally looked at her, his eyes moving from her habit to her face to her worn leather bag. He didn't see a woman of faith. He didn't see decades of education and service. He saw someone who didn't match his mental image of who belonged in their most valuable galleries. "Ma'am, that section is for serious researchers and religious scholars only. I'm going to have to ask you to visit our general collection instead." "I am a religious scholar," Sister Alicia replied evenly. "I have a doctorate in theological studies from Northwestern University, and I've published extensively on medieval contemplative texts." Greg crossed his arms. "Anyone can claim credentials. Do you have proof of affiliation with an accredited institution?" Sister Alicia reached into her satchel and pulled out her Northwestern faculty ID, her ordination certificate, and a letter of introduction from the conference she was attending. She placed them on Madison's desk calmly. Madison glanced at the documents, then looked at Greg. He didn't pick them up. He didn't examine them. He simply shook his head. "These could be fake. We've had problems with people trying to access valuable collections under false pretenses." That was when Denzel stepped forward. His voice was quiet but clear. "Greg, those look legitimate to me. Maybe we should verify them properly instead of making assumptions." Greg turned sharply toward his colleague. "I'm the head of security here. I make the calls about who poses a risk." But from the corner of the lobby, someone else was making calls too. Ryan Fletcher, a graduate student in art history from DePaul University, had been sitting in the museum cafe working on his thesis when he heard the commotion. He recognized Sister Alicia immediately. He had attended one of her lectures the previous semester, and he knew her reputation in academic circles. Ryan pulled out his phone and started recording. He didn't plan to live stream or post immediately. He just wanted evidence of what he was witnessing because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Excuse me," Ryan said, approaching the group. "I know this woman. She's Dr. Alicia Reeves. She's a respected scholar and a member of the faculty at Northwestern." Greg turned toward Ryan with irritation. "And you are?" "Ryan Fletcher, graduate student. I've attended her lectures. She's exactly who she says she is." Greg's jaw tightened. "I don't care who you think she is. I care about museum security. And right now I'm seeing someone trying to gain unauthorized access to restricted materials." Sister Alicia's voice remained steady. "Sir, I understand your commitment to security, but I'm asking you to look at my credentials with an open mind. I've provided everything you've requested." Greg didn't look down at the documents again. He looked around the lobby, noticed other visitors beginning to stare, and made the decision that would define the next 24 hours of his life. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You're causing a disturbance." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sister Alicia didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply asked, "What disturbance am I causing?" Greg gestured broadly. "You're holding up other guests. You're arguing with staff. And frankly, your behavior is making people uncomfortable." But the only people who looked uncomfortable were Madison, who kept glancing at her computer screen like she wanted to disappear, and Greg himself, whose face was growing redder by the minute. Ryan stepped closer, phone still recording. "She's not arguing with anyone. She provided identification and asked politely to see a collection that's supposed to be open to qualified researchers." Greg spun toward Ryan. "Put that phone away right now, or I'll have you removed too." But Ryan didn't put the phone away. Neither did Ashley Turner, the museum intern who had been cataloging books nearby and had started recording when she heard Greg's raised voice. Neither did Keaton Harris, a visitor from Detroit who had stopped browsing postcards to watch what was unfolding. Sister Alicia looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some were sympathetic. Some were confused. Some were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. But she had been here before, in different buildings, with different security guards, facing the same assumptions. "I'm going to leave now," she said quietly. "But not because I've done anything wrong." Greg nodded, satisfied. That's the right choice. But Sister Alicia wasn't finished. "I'm leaving because I refuse to be treated with disrespect in a place that claims to honor the sacred. And I'm going to make sure this conversation doesn't end here." She picked up her documents from Madison's desk, tucked them back into her satchel, and walked toward the exit with the same measured dignity she had brought when she entered. But Denzel Washington wasn't walking with her. He was standing behind the desk, watching his supervisor, wondering how many other guests had been treated this way while he looked the other way. Ryan Fletcher wasn't walking away either. He was uploading his video to social media with a simple caption, "None blocked from museum collection by security. This is wrong." And Ashley Turner wasn't going back to her cataloging. She was walking to the staff office to file an incident report that would land on the desk of the museum director within the hour. Sister Alicia reached the glass doors, paused for a moment, and turned back. She didn't look at Greg. She looked at the marble walls, the artwork, the carefully curated displays meant to inspire reverence and reflection. "This building houses sacred art," she said, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "But there's nothing sacred about how I've been treated here today." And with that, she walked out into the Chicago morning, leaving behind a lobby full of witnesses, a security guard who had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and a story that was about to explode across the internet. What Greg Morrison didn't know was that Sister Alicia wasn't just a nun. She wasn't just a scholar. She was the author of 3 books on social justice and faith, a frequent speaker at interfaith conferences, and someone who had learned, through decades of experience, that sometimes the only way to create change is to make noise. And the noise was about to get very, very loud. 1 hour after Sister Alicia Reeves walked out of the Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts, Ryan Fletcher's video had been shared 847 times on Instagram, reposted across Twitter with hashtags like museum discrimination and respect the habit, and picked up by 3 local news bloggers who specialized in social justice stories. The 4-minute clip showed everything: Greg Morrison's dismissive tone, his refusal to examine legitimate credentials, and his decision to force a respected scholar to leave because her presence made him uncomfortable. But Ryan's video was just the beginning. Ashley Turner, the museum intern who had been cataloging manuscripts when the confrontation erupted, had sent her own footage to the Chicago Tribune's anonymous tip line. Her email was brief but pointed. "Thought you should know what happened at one of our city's most respected cultural institutions today. This nun was humiliated for no reason other than being black in a space where someone decided she didn't belong." Within 30 minutes, the Tribune's religion reporter, Jasmine Crawford, was on the phone with Ryan Fletcher getting the full story. Jasmine had covered interfaith relations in Chicago for 7 years, and she knew Sister Alicia's reputation in academic and religious circles. The idea that someone of her stature had been ejected from a museum for trying to view religious art wasn't just newsworthy, it was explosive. But the real accelerant came from an unexpected source. Keaton Harris, the visitor from Detroit who had witnessed the encounter, happened to be the communications director for the Great Lakes Conference of Churches. When he posted the incident on his LinkedIn page, it wasn't just shared by friends and colleagues. It was seen by religious leaders across the Midwest, including Bishop Robert Sterling of the Chicago Archdiocese, who immediately forwarded it to his communications team with a note, "Find out everything about this situation, now." By 2 p.m., the story had reached the desks of reporters at CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, not because it was trending on social media, though it was, not because celebrities had shared it, though several had, but because Sister Alicia Reeves had spent 3 decades building relationships with religious leaders, academic institutions, and social justice organizations that amplified her voice when she needed it most. The phone in Sister Alicia's modest office at the Franciscan convent began ringing at 2:17 p.m. The first call was from Jasmine Crawford at the Tribune. The second was from a producer at WGN News. The third was from CNN's religion correspondent, asking if she would be available for a live interview at 5 p.m. Sister Alicia sat at her desk, looking at the stack of pink message slips her assistant had left, and made a decision that would shift the story from local incident to national conversation. She called them all back. Meanwhile, at the Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts, director Connor Walsh was having the worst day of his professional career. The museum's phone hadn't stopped ringing since noon. 3 board members had called demanding explanations. The Chicago Tribune had left 4 messages requesting interviews, and his inbox was flooded with emails from donors, community leaders, and museum patrons expressing outrage at what they had seen online. Connor Walsh had run the museum for 12 years. He prided himself on creating an inclusive space where people from all backgrounds could engage with religious art and history. The idea that his security team had ejected a prominent Catholic nun for being black was not just embarrassing, it was a betrayal of everything the museum claimed to represent. He called Greg Morrison into his office at 2:45 p.m. Greg walked in confident, expecting to be praised for maintaining security protocols. He had convinced himself that he had handled a potential threat appropriately, and he expected his boss to back him up. He was wrong. Connor Walsh didn't invite Greg to sit down. He didn't offer pleasantries. He placed a printed screenshot of Ryan Fletcher's video on his desk and asked one question. "What the hell were you thinking?" Greg looked at the image, his face flushing red. That woman was trying to access restricted materials without proper authorization. "I followed protocol." Connor Walsh leaned forward. "Protocol? Greg, I've seen the video. I've read her credentials. Dr. Alicia Reeves has a faculty appointment at Northwestern University, published scholarship on medieval religious texts, and legitimate research interests in our collection. What part of protocol involves ignoring valid identification and ejecting qualified scholars?" Greg's confidence began to crack. She seemed suspicious. People try to scam access to valuable collections all the time. Connor Walsh turned his computer screen toward Greg. The CNN homepage was showing a breaking news banner. "Catholic nun ejected from religious art museum by security guard." Below it was Sister Alicia's faculty photo and a brief biography highlighting her academic achievements and community service record. "Greg, that woman has been featured in America Magazine, the National Catholic Reporter, and Academic Quarterly. She's consulted with the Vatican on matters of social justice. She's not some random person trying to scam access to manuscripts. She's one of the most respected religious scholars in the Midwest." Greg stared at the screen, the reality of his mistake beginning to sink in. "And now," Connor continued, "because you couldn't be bothered to actually examine her credentials, our museum is being portrayed on national news as a place that discriminates against people of faith based on race. Do you understand what this means for our reputation, our funding, our relationships with religious communities across the city?" Greg tried to salvage the situation. "I was just being cautious. In today's environment, you can't be too careful about security." Connor Walsh stood up. "Greg, being careful about security means verifying credentials when someone presents them. It doesn't mean automatically assuming that a black woman in a religious habit is lying about being a nun." The phone on Connor's desk began ringing. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went pale. "That's the Archbishop's office," he said quietly. "They want to discuss our incident with one of their community's most respected members." Greg Morrison suddenly realized that his assumption about Sister Alicia being suspicious had just triggered a conversation between his boss and one of the most powerful religious figures in Chicago. Connor Walsh answered the phone. "Yes, Your Excellency." "No, sir, we're investigating immediately." "Yes, we understand the gravity of the situation." "No, sir, discrimination against people of faith will not be tolerated at this institution." He hung up and looked at Greg with something approaching disgust. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into your conduct and a review of all your interactions with museum guests over the past year." Greg's mouth fell open. "Connor, this is just one incident, one misunderstanding." Connor Walsh shook his head. "No, Greg, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is the consequence of treating people differently based on how they look instead of who they are. And it ends today." But while Greg Morrison was being suspended, Sister Alicia Reeves was preparing for her CNN interview. She sat in the network's Chicago bureau, wearing the same brown habit she had worn that morning, her manner calm and composed, despite the media storm swirling around her. The producer, a young woman named Brianna who had been covering religion and social justice stories for 3 years, approached with a wireless microphone. "Sister Alicia, thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. I know this has been difficult." Sister Alicia nodded. "It has been, but not for the reasons people might think." Brianna looked confused. "What do you mean?" Sister Alicia adjusted her habit and looked directly into the camera. "What happened to me today wasn't difficult because it was surprising. It was difficult because it was familiar. I've been a nun for 30 years and I've been black for 53. This wasn't the first time someone has looked at me and decided I didn't belong somewhere. It was just the first time it happened in a place dedicated to celebrating the faith I serve." Brianna nodded, understanding immediately why Sister Alicia's story was resonating far beyond Chicago. The interview began at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Sister Alicia spoke for 6 minutes about dignity, assumptions, and the responsibility of institutions to examine their biases. She didn't attack Greg Morrison personally. She didn't call for boycotts or protests. She simply told the truth about what had happened and asked one question: if a Catholic nun can't feel welcome in a museum of religious art, who can? The interview was shared 50,000 times within the first hour. By 6 p.m., it had been picked up by international news outlets. By 7 p.m., the Vatican's communications office was fielding questions from reporters around the world. And by 8 p.m., Greg Morrison was sitting in his living room, watching his face on CNN while his wife asked him how he had managed to create an international incident by throwing a nun out of a museum. But the story was far from over. Because what Greg Morrison didn't know was that Sister Alicia Reeves had spent the afternoon not just talking to reporters, but making phone calls to every interfaith organization, social justice group, and academic institution she had worked with over the past 3 decades. And they were all calling back. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Chicago chapter issued a statement at 8:30 p.m. calling for a full investigation into discriminatory practices at the museum. The American Academy of Religion condemned the incident and called for mandatory bias training for museum staff nationwide. The Conference of Major Superiors of Women Religious, representing more than 40,000 Catholic nuns across the United States, released a statement expressing solidarity with Sister Alicia and calling for accountability in cultural institutions. But the statement that got the most attention came at 9:15 p.m. Chicago time, released simultaneously in English, Spanish, and Italian by the Vatican Press Office. His Holiness Pope Francis expresses his concern regarding reports of discrimination against Sister Alicia Reeves at the Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts in Chicago. The Holy Father reminds all Catholics that dignity and respect for every person, regardless of race or background, is fundamental to our faith. He calls upon institutions that claim to serve the Catholic community to examine their practices and ensure that all people of faith are welcomed with the love Christ commands us to show one another. Sister Alicia was preparing for bed in her convent cell when her phone rang at 10:45 p.m. The caller ID showed an international number she didn't recognize. "Sister Alicia, this is Cardinal Martinez calling from the Vatican. His Holiness would like to speak with you personally about today's events." Sister Alicia sat down on her narrow bed, still wearing her habit, and realized that what had started as a morning trip to see medieval manuscripts had become a conversation with the Pope. Tomorrow, Greg Morrison would wake up to find his story on the front page of every major newspaper in America. He would discover that his decision to eject a black nun from a museum had created an international discussion about racism in religious spaces. And he would learn that his assumption about who belonged where had triggered the attention of the most powerful religious leader in the world. But tonight, in her simple room surrounded by books on social justice and theology, Sister Alicia Reeves sat quietly and prepared to speak with Pope Francis about dignity, discrimination, and what it means to create spaces where every person can encounter the sacred without fear. The phone call that would change everything was about to begin. At 11:15 p.m. Chicago time, Sister Alicia Reeves found herself connected to a voice she had only heard in recordings and papal addresses. Pope Francis spoke to her in English, his accent warm despite the gravity of the conversation. "Sister Alicia," His Holiness began, "I have been following the reports of what happened to you today. I want you to know that your experience troubles me deeply." Sister Alicia, still processing the surreal nature of receiving a personal call from the Vatican, responded with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the day. "Your Holiness, I'm honored by your concern. What happened today was painful, but it's also an opportunity to address larger questions about how we welcome people in spaces dedicated to faith." Pope Francis was quiet for a moment. In the background, Sister Alicia could hear the distant sounds of Rome at midnight. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of someone who had spent his papacy challenging institutions to live up to their stated values. "Sister, you have served the Church with distinction for 30 years. You have dedicated your life to scholarship, to justice, to serving the marginalized. That you were treated with disrespect in a place that houses sacred art is not just wrong, it is a betrayal of everything we claim to believe about human dignity." Sister Alicia felt tears she had been holding back all day finally begin to fall. "Your Holiness, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been made to feel unwelcome in spaces where they should find acceptance." The Pope's voice grew stronger, "which is why I am calling you tonight, and why tomorrow I will be calling the leadership of every Catholic institution in America to remind them that our buildings, our museums, our schools, our hospitals exist to serve all of God's children, without exception." The conversation continued for 23 minutes. They discussed Sister Alicia's scholarship, her work with marginalized communities, and her hopes for creating more inclusive religious spaces. When Pope Francis finally concluded the call, he left Sister Alicia with a message that would reshape the entire narrative of what had happened at the Museum of Sacred Arts. "Sister Alicia, I want you to know that you have my full support and the support of the Universal Church. Tomorrow, I will speak publicly about your experience, not to condemn those who failed you, but to remind all of us that we must do better." Sister Alicia thanked the Pope and hung up the phone. She sat in her room for a long time, looking at the crucifix on her wall, thinking about the strange path that had led from a morning encounter with a security guard to a midnight conversation with the leader of the Catholic Church. But while Sister Alicia was processing her conversation with Pope Francis, the story was continuing to evolve in ways that would transform a local incident into a global moment of reckoning. At the Museum of Sacred Arts, night security guard David Kim was doing his rounds when he noticed something unusual. The museum's phone was still ringing at midnight, long after normal business hours. When he checked the voicemail system, he found 347 messages from reporters, community leaders, donors, and concerned citizens. But it was message 348 that caught his attention. "This is Cardinal Thomas O'Brien calling from the Archdiocese of Chicago. I need to speak with Director Walsh first thing tomorrow morning about the incident involving Sister Alicia Reeves. The Archbishop will be expecting a full explanation and a plan for ensuring this never happens again." David Kim had worked night security for 3 years, and he had never heard a cardinal leave a voicemail at a museum. He immediately called Connor Walsh at home. Connor, who had been fielding calls from board members and reporters since the afternoon, answered on the first ring. "Mr. Walsh, this is David from the museum. You need to know that Cardinal O'Brien called. He wants to meet with you tomorrow about the Sister Alicia situation." Connor Walsh closed his eyes. The Cardinal's involvement meant this had escalated beyond a simple personnel issue. It was now a matter of institutional accountability at the highest levels of the Chicago Catholic community. "David, I need you to do something for me. Pull all the security footage from today. Everything from the lobby, the front desk, and the gallery entrances. Copy it to a secure drive and put it in my office safe." David Kim understood immediately. The footage would either support the museum's handling of the situation or provide evidence for whatever investigation was coming next. But as David was copying security footage, another conversation was taking place that would shift the story in an unexpected direction. Denzel Washington, the security guard who had witnessed Greg Morrison's treatment of Sister Alicia, was sitting in his apartment, unable to sleep. He had been replaying the morning's events in his mind, thinking about all the times he had watched Greg treat visitors of color differently from white guests. All the times he had stayed silent because he needed his job. Tonight, staying silent felt impossible. Denzel pulled out his phone and began typing an email to Connor Walsh. Mr. Walsh, my name is Denzel Washington, and I work security at the museum under Greg Morrison's supervision. I witnessed what happened with Sister Alicia today, and I need you to know that it wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past 6 months, I've seen Greg treat Black and Hispanic visitors with suspicion that he never shows white guests. I should have spoken up before, but I was afraid of retaliation. After seeing what happened to Sister Alicia, I can't stay quiet anymore. I have documentation of other incidents, and I'm willing to provide testimony about the pattern of discriminatory behavior I've observed. Denzel sent the email at 12:47 a.m. and immediately began gathering every incident report he had filed that Greg had dismissed, every complaint from visitors that had been ignored, every moment when he had watched bias masquerade as security protocol. By morning, Connor Walsh would have 2 problems instead of 1. A suspended security guard who had humiliated a respected nun, and evidence that the discrimination was systemic rather than isolated. But the biggest surprise was still coming. At 3:30 a.m. Rome time, 8:30 p.m. Chicago time the previous evening, Pope Francis had made a decision that would transform Sister Alicia's story from American news to global conversation. He instructed his communications team to prepare an unprecedented response, a personal video message addressing discrimination in religious spaces. The video was recorded at 6 a.m. Rome time and released simultaneously across all Vatican media platforms at 7 a.m. Rome time, 1 a.m. Chicago time. In the video, Pope Francis spoke directly to the camera, his manner both gentle and unmistakably firm. Yesterday, I learned of an incident in Chicago where Sister Alicia Reeves, a faithful servant of our church and distinguished scholar, was denied entry to a museum of religious art because a security guard decided she did not belong there. This troubles me not only because Sister Alicia was treated unjustly, but because her experience reflects a larger problem in our institutions. The Pope paused, his expression growing more serious. When we create spaces dedicated to the sacred, we have a responsibility to ensure that all people feel welcome to encounter God's presence. When we allow prejudice to determine who can access art, education, or inspiration, we betray the very faith these institutions claim to serve. Pope Francis leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the authority of his office. I call upon every Catholic institution, every leader, every person of faith to examine not just their policies, but their hearts. Do our actions reflect the love Christ commanded us to show? Do our spaces welcome all of God's children, or do they exclude those who don't match our expectations of what holiness looks like? The video concluded with words that would be quoted in newspapers around the world. Sister Alicia, you have my support, my admiration, and my prayers. To those who failed you, I offer not condemnation, but an invitation to conversion. Let this moment teach all of us that the measure of our faith is not found in the beauty of our buildings, but in the love we show to every person who enters them. The papal video was viewed 2.8 million times in the first 6 hours after its release. When Sister Alicia woke up at 5:30 a.m. for morning prayer, her phone showed 89 missed calls, 340 text messages, and 12 voicemails from international news organizations. The story had officially gone global. CNN ran a banner headline, Pope Francis supports nun ejected from museum. The BBC led with Vatican condemns discrimination in religious spaces. Fox News opened with Pope calls for institutions soul-searching after Chicago incident. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Catholic institutions across America began examining their own practices before anyone forced them to. The University of Notre Dame announced a comprehensive review of campus security protocols. Georgetown University launched a bias training program for all staff who interact with visitors. Catholic museums from Los Angeles to New York began auditing their guest services practices. Sister Alicia's experience had triggered something unprecedented. Proactive institutional change driven not by legal pressure or public shaming, but by genuine soul-searching about whether Catholic spaces truly lived up to Catholic values. At 7 a.m. Chicago time, Connor Walsh arrived at the museum to find protesters outside. Not angry crowds or shouting activists, but quiet groups of nuns, priests, and lay Catholics holding signs that read, "All are welcome," and "Justice for Sister Alicia." Inside, his voicemail system had crashed from the volume of messages. His inbox was flooded with emails from news organizations, but also from donors threatening to withdraw support, board members demanding emergency meetings, and community leaders expressing disappointment in the museum's handling of the situation. But it was the email from Denzel Washington that made Connor Walsh realize the Sister Alicia incident was not an isolated problem, but evidence of a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. At 8 a.m., Connor called an emergency staff meeting. Every employee, from curators to janitors, was required to attend. At 8:15, he called his lawyer. At 8:30, he called the museum's insurance company. At 8:45, he called Greg Morrison and informed him that his suspension had become termination, effective immediately. And at 9 a.m., Connor Walsh stood in front of his entire staff and said the words that would begin the museum's long journey toward rebuilding trust. Yesterday, we failed one of our community's most respected members. Today, we begin the work of ensuring it never happens again. But the most powerful moment was still to come. Because at 10 a.m., Sister Alicia Reeves walked back through the glass doors of the Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts, not as a visitor who had to prove her worthiness, but as a guest of honor invited by the director himself to see the medieval manuscripts she had originally come to study. This time, she was escorted not by security guards who questioned her presence, but by Connor Walsh personally, who spent 2 hours walking with her through galleries filled with the sacred art she had been denied the day before. The visit was covered by every major news network, but the most important witness was a small group of Catholic school children on a field trip who watched a black nun in a simple brown habit being treated with the respect and dignity that should have been hers from the beginning. One 8-year-old girl tugged on her teacher's sleeve and asked, "Why is everyone taking pictures of that sister?" Her teacher knelt down and said something that would stay with that child for the rest of her life. Because yesterday people forgot that she was special. Today, they're remembering. Sister Alicia's transformation from ejected visitor to honored guest was complete. But the larger transformation she had triggered was just beginning. 3 weeks after Sister Alicia Reeves was escorted from the Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts, the institution looked nothing like it had before. The changes went far beyond new policies or sensitivity training. They reflected a fundamental shift in how the museum understood its mission and its responsibility to the community it served. Connor Walsh stood in the same lobby where Greg Morrison had humiliated Sister Alicia, but the space felt different now. Gone was the implicit hierarchy that had made some visitors feel more welcome than others. In its place was an intentional culture of inclusion that started the moment someone walked through the glass doors. The first change was visible immediately. A large bronze plaque now hung near the entrance, inscribed with words from Pope Francis's video message. "The measure of our faith is not found in the beauty of our buildings, but in the love we show to every person who enters them." But the real transformation went deeper than symbolic gestures. Denzel Washington, the security guard who had found the courage to speak up about Greg Morrison's pattern of discrimination, was promoted to head of guest services. His first act was implementing a revolutionary approach to museum security. Instead of assuming visitors were potential threats, staff were trained to assume they were valued guests with legitimate interests in the collection. The change was immediately noticeable. Ashley Turner, the intern who had filmed the original incident, watched as Denzel greeted a young Hispanic man in work clothes who approached the information desk asking about the Byzantine collection. "Good morning," Denzel said with genuine warmth. "Are you interested in our Byzantine art? We have some incredible pieces, including manuscripts that aren't on public display. Would you like me to arrange access to our study room?" The visitor's eyes widened. "I'm actually a doctoral student at University of Chicago. I've been researching iconography, but I wasn't sure if I'd be allowed to see the restricted pieces." Denzel smiled. "That's exactly why they're here. Let me get you connected with our curator. She'll be thrilled to show you the collection." Ashley watched the interaction with tears in her eyes. 3 weeks ago, that same visitor might have been treated with suspicion, questioned about his credentials, maybe even asked to leave. Today, he was being welcomed as a scholar and connected with resources to advance his research. The transformation extended beyond individual interactions to institutional policy. Connor Walsh had commissioned a comprehensive audit of the museum's practices, conducted by an independent firm specializing in bias assessment in cultural institutions. The results were sobering. The audit revealed that over the past 2 years, 73% of visitors questioned about their legitimate interest in restricted collections were people of color. 89% of guests asked to provide additional identification beyond what was required were Black or Hispanic, and 100% of visitors escorted from the premises for suspicious behavior that didn't involve actual misconduct were minorities. The pattern was undeniable. What Greg Morrison had done to Sister Alicia wasn't an aberration. It was the extreme end of a continuum of bias that had been operating unchecked for years. Connor Walsh didn't just acknowledge the findings, he made them public. Standing in the same lobby where Sister Alicia had been humiliated, Connor held a press conference that was covered by local and national media. Behind him stood Sister Alicia herself, along with Denzel Washington, several board members, and representatives from community organizations that had been advocating for change. "We failed," Connor said simply. "Not just on one morning 3 weeks ago, but systematically, over years. We allowed assumptions about who belongs in cultural spaces to override our commitment to serving all members of our community." He gestured to the audit report in his hands. "This document shows that what happened to Sister Alicia was part of a larger pattern. We're not just addressing one incident. We're transforming an institution." The reforms Connor announced were comprehensive. Every staff member would complete 40 hours of bias training, not as punishment, but as professional development. The museum would partner with community organizations to ensure diverse representation on advisory boards. Guest services protocols would be redesigned to eliminate subjective judgments about who looked like they belonged. But the most significant change was philosophical. The museum would shift from a model of protecting valuable collections from potentially unworthy visitors to one of connecting people with cultural treasures they had every right to experience. Sister Alicia stepped to the microphone, wearing the same brown habit she had worn on the morning that changed everything. 3 weeks ago, I was made to feel unwelcome in a place dedicated to sacred art. Today, I stand here not as someone who was wronged, but as someone who was given an opportunity to help create change. She paused, looking around the lobby filled with reporters, community members, and museum staff. What happened to me was painful, but what has happened since then has been hopeful. This institution didn't just apologize, it examined itself. It didn't just change policies, it changed culture. Sister Alicia gestured toward Denzel Washington. It elevated voices that had been marginalized. It created space for truth-telling. It chose transparency over defensiveness. The press conference was covered extensively, but the real measure of change wasn't in news coverage. It was in the daily experiences of visitors who found themselves welcomed in ways they hadn't expected. 2 days after the press conference, Maria Gonzalez brought her teenage daughter Isabella to see the museum's collection of Latina religious art. Maria had been hesitant, worried that they might not be made to feel welcome in such an upscale institution. Isabella was researching her heritage for a school project, but Maria wasn't sure they would be allowed to access specialized materials. Their concerns evaporated the moment they walked through the entrance. Denzel Washington greeted them personally, asking about Isabella's project and offering to connect them with the curator who specialized in Latin American religious traditions. Within minutes, Isabella was examining 16th-century manuscripts that documented the syncretism between indigenous traditions and Catholicism in Mexico. The curator, Dr. Patricia Valdez, spent an hour explaining the historical context and encouraging Isabella to consider pursuing art history in college. As they left, Maria stopped at the information desk to thank Denzel. He smiled and handed her a card. "Please come back anytime," he said. "This is your museum. These are your stories. You belong here." Maria walked to her car with tears in her eyes, thinking about how different this experience was from what she had expected. Her daughter was already planning her next visit. But the changes at the museum were part of a larger transformation triggered by Sister Alicia's experience. Across Chicago, Catholic institutions were examining their own practices, asking hard questions about whether their policies and cultures truly reflected their stated values. Cardinal O'Brien had called a meeting of all Catholic institution leaders in the Archdiocese. The gathering included university presidents, hospital administrators, school principals, and directors of social service organizations. His message was direct. The Sister Alicia incident had exposed problems that existed throughout Catholic institutional culture, and comprehensive change was required. "We have spent decades talking about welcome and inclusion," Cardinal O'Brien said to the assembled leaders. "Sister Alicia's experience shows us the gap between our rhetoric and our reality. That gap ends now." The Cardinal announced the creation of the Archdiocese Commission on Institutional Inclusion, chaired by Sister Alicia herself. The commission would audit practices across all Catholic institutions in Chicago, provide training and resources for culture change, and create accountability mechanisms to ensure that bias didn't hide behind policy. Sister Alicia accepted the appointment with characteristic humility. "I didn't seek this role," she said, "but I accept it because I believe institutions can change when they commit to honesty about their failures and dedication to doing better." The Commission's first report, released 6 months later, would document bias patterns across dozens of institutions and provide a roadmap for systemic change. But its most powerful finding was simple. When institutions created cultures of genuine welcome, everyone benefited. Diverse staff brought fresh perspectives. Inclusive policies attracted broader community support. And organizational missions were fulfilled more completely when they served all people rather than selecting populations. The Sister Alicia effect, as it came to be known, spread beyond Chicago. Catholic institutions across the country began conducting their own bias audits. Seminary training programs added coursework on cultural competency. Museum Association conferences featured sessions on creating inclusive visitor experiences. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Greg Morrison, the security guard whose assumptions had started everything, reached out to Sister Alicia 6 months after his termination. He asked to meet with her, not to defend his actions, but to understand how his biases had caused harm and what he could do to make amends. They met at a coffee shop near the Franciscan convent where Sister Alicia lived. Greg was nervous, contrite, clearly struggling with the consequences of his actions. He had been unable to find work in museum security, partly because of his termination, but mostly because he was carrying guilt about treating someone so badly. "Sister Alicia, I don't expect forgiveness," Greg said. "I just want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. I let my assumptions override my responsibility to treat everyone with dignity." Sister Alicia listened carefully, then responded with characteristic grace. "Greg, what happened between us was painful, but pain can be transformative if we let it teach us. You're here because you want to learn. That's the beginning of real change." They talked for 2 hours. Greg shared stories about growing up in an all-white suburb, about never having meaningful relationships with people of color, about how his fear of difference had hardened into prejudice. Sister Alicia shared her own experiences of discrimination, but also stories of reconciliation and growth. At the end of their conversation, Sister Alicia made an unexpected offer. She was developing bias training workshops for institutions across the Midwest. Would Greg consider sharing his story as part of the curriculum? Not to shame him, but to help others understand how good people can cause harm when they don't examine their assumptions. Greg was stunned. "You want me to help with anti-bias training?" Sister Alicia nodded. Who better to talk about the cost of prejudice than someone who has experienced that cost personally? Your story could help prevent others from making the same mistakes. Greg Morrison became one of the most effective trainers in Sister Alicia's program, precisely because he could speak from experience about how unconscious bias becomes discriminatory action. His presentations were powerful not despite his failure, but because of his willingness to own it and learn from it. The transformation was complete. An incident that began with exclusion had created inclusion. A moment of discrimination had generated systemic change, and a security guard's assumption about who belonged where had ultimately opened doors for people who had been kept outside for too long. Sister Alicia often reflected on the strange path that had led from a morning visit to see medieval manuscripts to a national conversation about bias in religious institutions. She hadn't planned to become a symbol of institutional change. She had simply refused to accept being treated with disrespect in a space dedicated to the sacred, but perhaps that was the point. Change often begins not with grand gestures or planned campaigns, but with ordinary people refusing to accept extraordinary injustice. Sister Alicia had walked into a museum as a scholar seeking knowledge. She had left as a catalyst for transformation that would benefit countless others. The Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts became a model for inclusive cultural institutions. Visitors from around the world came not just to see the religious art collection, but to observe how museums could serve all people with dignity and respect. And in the Renaissance Religious Art Wing, the same medieval manuscripts that Sister Alicia had originally come to study were now accessible to any qualified researcher, regardless of race, background, or appearance. The collection hadn't changed, but the assumptions about who deserved to see it had been transformed completely. Sister Alicia finally got to spend time with those manuscripts, not as a visitor whose presence was questioned, but as an honored scholar whose expertise was valued. As she examined the contemplative texts that had influenced her doctoral work decades earlier, she thought about how discrimination had tried to separate her from sources of knowledge and inspiration. But discrimination had failed. Not just because policies had changed, but because people had chosen to see each other differently. The security guard who had once blocked her path had become an advocate for inclusion. The institution that had rejected her had become a model for welcome, and the community that had witnessed her humiliation had become committed to ensuring it never happened again. The manuscripts Sister Alicia studied that day contained wisdom from medieval mystics about encountering the divine in unexpected places. As she read their words in the quiet study room that was now freely accessible to all qualified researchers, she reflected on how the sacred had been present even in her moment of greatest humiliation. Sometimes, she thought, transformation begins with exclusion, but it ends with doors opening wider than they ever had before. 1 year after Sister Alicia Reeves was ejected from the Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts, the institution hosted its first annual Doors Wide Open celebration. The event was designed not to commemorate a painful incident, but to celebrate the transformation that had grown from it. The museum looked dramatically different than it had 12 months earlier. Where once stood barriers, both physical and cultural, there were now bridges. The lobby buzzed with activity as visitors from every background moved freely between exhibitions, no longer wondering whether they would be welcomed or questioned. Sister Alicia stood near the bronze plaque that bore Pope Francis's words, watching families, students, and scholars explore collections that were now truly accessible to all. Beside her stood Denzel Washington, whose courage in speaking truth about institutional bias had earned him not just promotion, but recognition as a national leader in museum inclusion practices. The celebration drew visitors from across the country. Museum directors came to learn about transformation strategies. Religious leaders participated in interfaith panels about creating welcoming sacred spaces. Academic researchers presented findings about the connection between institutional inclusion and community engagement. But the most powerful moment came when Greg Morrison walked through the same glass doors where he had once exercised the authority to exclude. He was attending not as a former employee, but as a featured speaker in the museum's Bias Awareness Program. Greg's presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main auditorium. As the hour approached, Sister Alicia found herself walking beside the man who had caused her so much pain a year earlier. "Are you nervous?" she asked quietly. Greg nodded. "Every time I tell this story, I relive the shame of what I did to you. But I also remember why it matters that people hear it." They walked together toward the auditorium, an unlikely partnership born from crisis and sustained by mutual commitment to preventing similar harm. Greg's presentation was simple but profound. He stood in front of 200 museum professionals, religious leaders, and community members and told the truth about how his assumptions had turned him into an instrument of discrimination. "A year ago, I looked at Sister Alicia and saw someone who didn't match my mental image of who belonged in our premium collection. I didn't see her credentials, her scholarship, or her decades of service to the church. I saw her race, made assumptions about her worthiness, and acted on those assumptions in ways that caused real harm." The audience was silent as Greg continued. "I'm here today not because I want sympathy for the consequences of my actions. I'm here because Sister Alicia believed that my failure could become a tool for education. She transformed my worst moment into an opportunity for others to examine their own biases before they cause similar damage." Greg gestured towards Sister Alicia, who was sitting in the front row. "She didn't just forgive me, she invited me to be part of the solution. That's the kind of grace that changes people and institutions." The presentation was followed by a workshop where Greg worked with museum staff to identify subtle signs of bias in visitor interactions. His insights were invaluable precisely because they came from someone who had acted on bias and experienced its consequences. During the break, a young curator approached Greg with tears in her eyes. "I've been treating visitors differently based on how they look," she said quietly. "I didn't realize it until I heard you speak. How do I stop?" Greg's response reflected the wisdom he had gained through painful self-examination. "You start by admitting it, like you just did. Then you watch yourself carefully, question your assumptions, and ask for feedback from colleagues who can help you see blind spots. Most importantly, you remember that every person who walks through our doors deserves the same respect you'd want for yourself." Meanwhile, Sister Alicia was participating in a panel discussion about institutional change in religious spaces. Her co-panelists included Cardinal O'Brien, Connor Walsh, and directors from Catholic institutions that had implemented reforms based on the Commission's recommendations. The conversation focused on a question from the audience. How do you sustain culture change beyond the initial crisis that creates it? Sister Alicia's response drew from her year of experience leading institutional transformation across the Archdiocese. Crisis creates urgency, but sustainable change requires systems. We can't rely on good intentions or individual awareness. We need policies that eliminate bias, training that builds cultural competency, and accountability mechanisms that ensure progress continues even when attention moves elsewhere. She gestured toward the diverse audience filling the auditorium. Most importantly, we need to expand leadership to include voices that have been marginalized. The people who have experienced exclusion are often the ones best equipped to create inclusion. Cardinal O'Brien nodded in agreement. The Commission's Sister Alicia chairs has transformed not just policies, but culture across our Archdiocese. We're seeing increased diversity in leadership, more inclusive programming, and measurably improved community relationships. Connor Walsh added his perspective as someone who had led institutional transformation at the ground level. Change is hard and sometimes uncomfortable. We had to acknowledge failures, replace staff, and invest significant resources in training and system reform. But the results speak for themselves. Our visitor numbers are up 40%. Community engagement has increased dramatically, and staff satisfaction is higher because people are proud to work for an institution that lives its values. The panel was followed by breakout sessions where participants worked on specific strategies for their own institutions. The energy was palpable as people shared ideas, resources, and commitments to continue the work of transformation. But perhaps the most significant moment of the day came during the closing ceremony, when a surprise guest appeared via video link from the Vatican. Pope Francis, speaking from his private study, addressed the gathering with words that captured the global significance of what had started as a local incident. 1 year ago, Sister Alicia experienced discrimination that should never happen in any Catholic space. Today, we celebrate not just her resilience, but the transformation her experience has created across your country and beyond. The Pope leaned forward, his expression serious but hopeful. The changes we have seen in Chicago prove that institutions can change when they commit to honest self-examination and sustained action. But this work is not finished. It must continue in every Catholic institution, in every community, until the promise of universal welcome becomes lived reality. Pope Francis concluded with a direct message to Sister Alicia. Sister, your grace in the face of injustice has taught the world about the power of forgiveness without forgetting, of healing without ignoring harm. You have shown us that transformation is possible when we choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience. The video ended to sustained applause, but Sister Alicia was thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a private person, a scholar who preferred research to public attention. Today, she was recognized internationally as a symbol of institutional change and interfaith reconciliation. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, criticism from some who thought she was pushing too hard for change, and exhaustion from traveling constantly to speak at conferences and workshops. But there had also been profound satisfaction in seeing real change take root in institutions across the country. The commission she chaired had now worked with over 200 Catholic institutions, helping them identify and address bias in their policies and practices. The training programs she had developed were being used by secular organizations as well as religious ones, and the network of relationships she had built was creating lasting change far beyond what any single incident might have accomplished. As the celebration concluded and visitors began to leave, Sister Alicia found herself back in the Renaissance religious art wing, standing in front of the medieval manuscripts she had originally come to study. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to prevent her from accessing these texts, Greg Morrison had ultimately created a situation that gave her a much larger platform for the scholarship and advocacy work the manuscripts had inspired. Denzel Washington joined her in the quiet gallery space. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if Greg had just looked at your credentials that morning?" he asked. Sister Alicia considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I wonder about that. But I also think about all the other people who have been treated the way I was treated, but didn't have the platform or support to create change from their experiences. Maybe what happened to me needed to happen so that it wouldn't happen to others." Denzel nodded. "The museum gets letters every week from visitors saying how welcomed they felt here. Yesterday, a young black seminarian came to research early Christian art for his thesis. A year ago, he might have been questioned or turned away. Yesterday, our curator spent 3 hours helping him access rare materials and connecting him with scholars at other institutions." Sister Alicia smiled. "That's why the pain was worth it. Every person who now feels welcomed in a space where they previously would have been excluded, every institution that has examined its biases and changed its practices, every community that has become more inclusive, that's the real measure of transformation." As they walked back through the lobby, past the bronze plaque with Pope Francis's words, past the information desk where Denzel now welcomed visitors with genuine warmth, past the exhibition spaces that truly served all people, Sister Alicia reflected on how completely the museum had been transformed. But more than that, she thought about how she had been transformed. The shy scholar who had preferred research to public speaking had become a voice for institutional change. The private person who had avoided controversy had become someone willing to challenge systems of exclusion wherever she found them. The incident that had started with one security guard's assumptions about who belonged where had become a movement that opened doors across the country. Sister Alicia's humiliation had become the foundation for countless others' inclusion. As she prepared to leave the museum, Sister Alicia stopped one more time at the bronze plaque bearing Pope Francis's words. She read them again, thinking about how much wisdom was contained in that simple statement. The measure of our faith is not found in the beauty of our buildings, but in the love we show to every person who enters them. A year ago, this building had failed that test. Today, it was a model for how institutions could embody love through policies, practices, and culture that truly welcomed all people. Sister Alicia walked through the glass doors into the Chicago afternoon, the same doors through which she had been escorted in humiliation 12 months earlier. But everything had changed. She was no longer a visitor whose presence was questioned. She was a catalyst whose experience had transformed not just one institution, but an entire network of organizations committed to creating spaces where everyone could encounter beauty, knowledge, and the sacred without fear. The security guard who had tried to exclude her was now traveling the country helping others recognize and address their own biases. The museum that had rejected her was now a destination for people seeking to understand how institutions could change. The incident that had wounded her had become a source of healing for countless others. As Sister Alicia walked down the street, she passed a group of Catholic school students heading toward the museum for a field trip. They chatted excitedly about the art they would see, the manuscripts they would examine, the questions they would ask. None of them would be turned away. None of them would be made to feel unwelcome. None of them would experience the pain of being told they didn't belong in a space dedicated to the sacred. That, Sister Alicia thought, was the true measure of transformation. Not the policies that had been changed or the training that had been implemented, but the simple fact that every person walking through those doors would be welcomed with the dignity and respect that should have been hers from the beginning. The circle was complete. From exclusion had come inclusion. From humiliation had come honor. From one woman's pain had come countless people's access to beauty, knowledge, and sacred space. Sister Alicia continued down the street, her simple brown habit catching the afternoon sunlight, her step confident and purposeful. She had work to do, institutions to transform, and people to serve. The incident that had tried to diminish her had instead enlarged her influence beyond anything she could have imagined. And in the Metropolitan Museum of Sacred Arts, the Renaissance Religious Art Collection waited for its next visitor, its doors truly open to all who came seeking beauty, wisdom, and encounter with the sacred, regardless of race, background, or the assumptions others might make about their worthiness. The transformation was complete. But the work of inclusion, Sister Alicia knew, would continue for as long as there were doors to open and people who needed welcome. That work was her legacy, born from pain but sustained by hope, rooted in justice but flowering in love. The security guard had tried to block her path. Instead, he had helped her clear the way for everyone else.